But since we're all gathered, why don't we start? And Aviva, do you want to open?
Yeah, definitely. Let me just grab my notes. Hello, I'm Aviva. I work for Gumshoe, and I'm so excited to have everyone here today. So just for people who aren't familiar with the Gumshoe Group, we're running this event with the Reporters Committee. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Gumshoe first. So as many of you know, of course, freelancer investigative reporters produce brave, time-intensive work that news organizations often cannot undertake and at significant personal risk and with diminished structural and financial support. So the Gumshoe Group was founded by Azmat and Seth Wessler to support freelance investigative reporters by connecting them with lawyers in pursuit of public records, offering workshops and trainings like this one, and providing resources and tools and coordinating investigative collaborations. We're so excited that Adam and Azmat are here for this event. It's part of our Crowbar Chronicles series where we have a reporter and sometimes the attorney that assisted them in obtaining records to talk about the project in detail and really enable reporters, freelancers, and others to get a sense of what it takes to do this investigation from beginning to end. And just a quick note before I introduce our amazing speakers in this important project. For freelance reporters on this webinar, Gumshoe wants you to know that if you need assistance like filing, drafting, or litigating requests, we're here to help. So if that's you or if that might be you in the future, all you have to do is fill out our intake form. So I'll pop that into the chat after I'm done introducing everyone. And secondly, we just extended the deadline for our public records grant program. So if you're a freelancer who's been dreaming or working on a public records driven investigation and you could benefit from some financial support to make that happen, please consider applying. And we've just extended the deadline to May 11th. So I'll put that at the link in too. Finally, to get to today's important event, in 2021, investigative reporter and Gumshoe co-founder Azmat Khan published the Civilian Casualty Files in the New York Times, a multi-part investigation into the civilian casualties from America's air wars across the Middle East. With legal support from the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, Khan obtained more than 1,300 of the military's own internal reviews into allegations of civilian casualties in Iraq and Syria. The investigation, which was also based on ground reporting at the sites of hundreds of civilian casualty incidents in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, and scores of interviews, revealed how American wars of precision strikes were systematically marred by flawed intelligence, faulty reporting, and scant accountability. So a little more about our two speakers. Azmat Khan is an award-winning investigative reporter, a New York Times Magazine contributing writer, a Carnegie Fellow, and a professor of journalism. Her investigations have exposed major myths of war, prompting widespread policy impact from Washington to Kabul, and winning nearly a dozen awards, including the National Magazine Award, the Hillman Prize, the Overseas Press, many impressive awards. And she's also a founder of the Gumshoe Group and a beloved member of our team. And Adam Marshall is a senior staff attorney at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. His work includes litigation in federal and state courts and training journalists on government transparency. He's the co-author of chapters in Troubling Transparency and COVID-19, The Legal Challenges. He's a recipient of the President's Volunteer Service Award and the GW Law Pro Bono Service Recognition Award. And in 2017, he was named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 media list for his work promoting government transparency, including the development of the Foia Wiki. So we're so excited to have them here. There's a couple of kind of valuable links to Azmat's story and also to the records themselves that I'm going to pop into the chat in case folks want to have a look either now or afterwards. And with no further ado, I'll pass it on to our speakers.
Great. Thank you, Aviva. It's so exciting to be here, especially with Adam, who I've been working with for many years now. I think since
many years.
Yes. And RCFP is just such a special group. I just want to highlight, we're going to be talking about some of their resources throughout, but and we'll chat about this a little bit later, but I went to, when I was starting to do this reporting, I went to a number of places to try to get legal assistance, and Adam was so fast in replying and just so industrious about it and thinking about all of this. So I'm really excited that the two of us get to be in conversation about this, because you're going to get at this from two different angles, and hopefully anyone who's interested in FOIAing the DoD can walk out of this with a means for having a better means into that, but also, the kinds of language and strategies you might use to do this as well. But this didn't happen overnight, and FOIA can be a sort of years-long process. So Adam, maybe you could just start, if you don't mind, by just sort of addressing the sort of concept of FOIA in the first place, and then we can talk a little bit more about, its application in terms of how journalists sometimes use it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also incredibly excited to be here to talk to you all. At the Reporters Committee, this is like what we live for. Most of us are attorneys who just want to promote and ensure that the news gathering rights of journalists in the United States are protected. And so FOIA is a big part of what we do. And as Azmat said, it doesn't come easily always, but sometimes that's where we get involved. So for those that don't know, FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, is a law that's been around for more than 50 years now. It generally provides anyone, anywhere, inside the United States, outside the United States, citizen, non-citizen, a right to gather records of federal government agencies, unless they fall within the scope of one of the 9 exemptions in the Act. It doesn't apply to the president or the vice president, or people whose sole job is to advise the president. But other than that, just about every federal agency you could think of, DOD, DOJ, Commerce, FTC, all those types of things are subject to FOIA. And there's amazing, amazing reporting that comes out every single day based on FOIA. I highly recommend the Foia Feed Twitter account, which literally just tweets stories based on public records. It's a really great way to get a sense of like the type of reporting that happens every single day because of public records. But those don't just magically appear. You have to do a lot of work and digging to get those records. And that's what I hope to talk to you all about today with Azmat, both in connection with her reporting, but also, as you all are thinking about your own projects. So Azmat, I actually wanted to ask you some questions to get us going on this. And in your interview on The Daily, I think it was earlier this year with Michael Barbaro, he started off by saying that you don't frequently appear on The Daily, but when you do, it's often for something that's quite revelatory and something that people pay attention to. And so I was thinking in the context of your investigative work, which is often longer and more in depth than a lot of just kind of like daily reporting, how do you see FOIA fitting into your like investigative work? Like, how do you think about FOIA? What are the timelines, what are the expectations in terms of just using FOIA as a tool? Because it can be frustrating so often. So how do you go about thinking, how is this going to fit in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think at the outset, because the timeline can be long and what you might get may not be what you wanted, I think you kind of have to temper your expectations while at the same time utilizing all of the other approaches at your disposal. So, I would still be pressing sources within the government and trying to get information. And actually, sometimes I would, and I'll show you how I did this later, but sometimes I would cite what some of those sources told me in emails. Like I would literally attach emails into my FOIAs as a means to show that whatever records I was requesting existed. But these things can work in tandem. So, I would encourage you to figure out and understand what files and documents are in existence or, you believe may be in existence that you want and that might be able to help inform your reporting. I know that for me, oftentimes it starts with something smaller, not always, but sometimes it'll be an individual case that I really need the documents because I have to get into such detail about this individual case that I need to be able to verify, corroborate, especially if you have a main character, you want as much, you're putting them on the best ground if you're getting as much documentation as possible. You don't want things to fall apart for somebody or for them to, pay the consequences of being a main character and, there not being necessarily a lot of information for them to stand on to get them through a fact check and everything that you need. And so usually it starts, with maybe something specific that I want. And because something specific you may be able to get sooner, but you start to sort of understand the landscape through, for me, it's usually there's like a test case, and I start to understand the landscape of what's obtainable or how to go about getting things in preparation for something that might be a larger FOIA request or something in which I might be asking for a lot more, because now having done this smaller thing that I went after, I have a better sense of that landscape, and I can go into this next request, with as strong as possible. And in the context of my reporting, if I'm investigating the government, obviously, they often have things in their possession that I may want to fact check. It's not just that document itself is the thing that I want to publish. It might be that these documents contain claims that they have, and I want to check if those claims are actually true on the ground, or, the United States often, and for this project, and we can talk a little bit more about how this unfolded, but for this one, when you're looking at anything related to national security, our government, our military, our other agencies involved in intelligence have for so long denied access to materials on the basis that it's classified, that it would harm national security to reveal it. And it's not a sure bet, but I think my quest for these records really came out of hitting that wall so often, in which I can go on the ground and I can report out details from people who give their accounts and then be given a response from sources, from spokespeople, that, we have access to information that you don't, and it's classified. And I think this really started as my attempt to get my hands on whatever that might be, and whatever I could actually obtain.
Yeah, and I really like this tactic of taking like a small bite at the apple to see kind of what it tastes like first, and then trying to replicate that on a larger scale. And I want to ask you about that. But before we get into that, for people who are thinking about doing FOIA work, especially a lot of FOIAs or FOIAs for a large amount of material, how would you guide them in terms of how should they go about like organizing themselves? How should they go about designing, their project? How should they go about keeping track of everything as it comes in or goes out? Because I think that you're very effective at this, and I think that others would really benefit from kind of your knowledge as you've gone through this.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. I'm sure that there are ways in which I could be better, but for me, so often, I kind of just incorporate it into my, I'm not going to be, it's not like I'll do like a month of FOIA and then a month of nothing or something else. I try to incorporate it into like every week, in some way. Let me check on my, let me look at whether or not I've received responses, or if this particular deadline has elapsed, or whatever it might be. But one way to do that is to just create a Foia Tracker for yourself, in which you're kind of compiling the requests that you have in. And it's really important to do not just for yourself, but like if later on you want to litigate or you want legal assistance, maintaining that sense of organization is going to be extremely helpful to any attorneys who you want to work with. It may be more likely that they will be willing to accept your case too, if you've kept this in an organized manner, if you can show that in an organized manner. So I'm going to share a screen briefly to kind of show you what, this is not the current version that I'm using, but this is like an old version of a Foia Tracker I used in the past, which looked like this, in which you can see that I would put in whatever the subject description was, the agency, the case number, the date I submitted it, whatever the latest status of that was. And then I would create a folder with all of the documents and the correspondence related to that, and different kinds of things that I could follow up with, I would keep track of. I know that there are other ways to do this, that Muckrock, which is another organization, has like Foia trackers that you can follow through their system. There are other ways to do this, but I would really recommend that you keep this organized and you keep your correspondence organized. So I do, every time I would, for example, follow up with the agency, I would create a PDF of my email and put it in a folder within that case folder called correspondence with like the date and from me to them. And when they respond, I would put that in there as well. And I would keep like a record of it at all times. You can go and get it later, but imagine if you have all of that in one place, not just for your attorneys, but for yourself when you're trying to make sense of something, like when you're doing we're going to talk about this later, but if you're writing an administrative appeal, you're going to want that procedural history. If you're doing your complaint, when you're litigating, you're going to want that as well. And so, you might even find like, oh, actually, upon more careful read, they never gave me a reason for why they were denying, why I didn't meet the grounds for compelling need for expedited processing. You'll notice these things that might give you a stronger case to make later on. And so the more organized you can be, the better.
As an attorney, I cannot emphasize that enough, and we'll get into that a little bit more, but it really does help, and it makes me, and I think other attorneys, so happy when we have clients that come to us with neatly nestled folders. It's a beautiful thing. Well, Azmat, let me ask you now, specifically going into the FOIAs that form the basis of your reporting, both in The Uncounted, which was a piece that you did back in 2017, and then more recently for the Civilian Casualty Files, which is a multi-part series that was published in December and is kind of still ongoing. How did you come up with the FOIAs for these projects? How did you figure out what kinds of records you wanted to ask for? How did it fit into your larger reporting strategy? And how did it go in terms of creating these and sending them in to DoD?
Yeah. So I think I might just start with what that original reporting project that I was doing was and how I was sort of thinking about it. So I'm going to share screen and this should work. Give me a second. Okay. So you should right now be able to see a map that says, ISIS. This is actually it's not today. It says ISIS in 2015 versus today. Today is not accurate. This is maybe 2018 or 2018 that this is from. But basically, I was watching the war against ISIS and I was looking at these sorts of claims of airstrikes. And it was very clear as territory was being retaken that air power was a major factor in the ability for the United States and its allies to retake territory. And I was watching, that war against ISIS is known as Operation Inherent Resolve. And I was watching the sort of claims coming out. They were uploading videos to YouTube of these strikes. They were putting out these press releases constantly about not just the precision of this warfare, but the numbers of ISIS fighters that were being killed. And I remember early on, and I think it was April of 2016, there was a statistic about these like tens of thousands of ISIS fighters who'd been killed in airstrikes. And I also knew that at that time, a very small percentage of civilians, in fact, if you looked at the numbers, this is back a few years ago, they had conducted 14,000 airstrikes in Iraq, 15,000 in Syria. They dropped more than 106,000 bombs, killed as many as 70,000 ISIS fighters, according to these claims. And if you added it up, by the end of it, by the time I was working on The Uncounted, they said that they had killed 883 civilians. The number is higher now, but this is back when I was sort of looking at this. And that would have been a civilian death rate of 0.07, so less than 1%. And so actually, when I first started this, I think they had admitted 8 civilian deaths. I had been tracking all of them. And that just seemed to me not possible, right? They were claiming to have this incredible process. And so I thought I would go on the ground to investigate. And in doing so, my hope was that I would be able to do a sample of airstrikes and understand how many were in fact killing civilians and how many were not. And, I met a person. This is a video of one of those strikes. And you can just see how precise it is in terms of there are these 2 structures in what looks like this compound that were hit. And, this video was uploaded to YouTube. This is one of those videos that was shared. And this was called a VBIED facility, which is a car bomb factory in Mosul. And I actually knew it to be, if you look at this before, during, and after, you can see just what this looks like from the air. But from my reporting, I knew that this was the home of a man named Bassem Razo. And this was, you can see this is a photo of his house before that bombing. And, he was someone whom I had gotten to know quite well. And this video existed on YouTube, and I was reporting out the details of his case. Because that video existed, I knew he was probably going to be a main character whose journey I would follow. He had documented so much of what had happened to him himself that there were all of these documents for me to rely on. This goes to that point about, you want a main character whose story you can stand up with as much detail as possible. And he was just very clearly that person. And there was this video. And so I was pursuing, what happened when he had tried to report the civilian casualty incident that killed his wife and his brother and his daughter and his nephew. These 4 people. He survived. He had horrible injuries. And I just wanted to figure out what happened. These deaths of his family members were never included in those press releases. And so I had been taking those videos to the coalition. I had been talking to them about them. And they were like, we have no record of this. And then ultimately, like through email, they confirmed, okay, we did conduct an assessment into this. We did do a credibility assessment. It actually was considered credible, meaning that they believed civilians had been killed, but due to, I think they said, administrative oversight, it had never been, those numbers had never been included in these press releases that they were putting out. And so I knew that a document existed that they claimed to have investigated this incident and concluded that civilians had died. And yet, they'd never told Bassem that. They'd never made any of that information public. And I knew I wanted to get my hands on it. And so, I kind of sat back and I was like, well, and this is, me and Bassem, when we visited, this is his first time back to the house in May of 2017 when we went. But I knew I wanted to get my hands on that document. Like it would be, if you're thinking about his journey, he wanted to see it. I wanted to understand what they thought they were hitting. How did they think that was a car bomb factory? I know that there's a process that exists for them to assess these claims when there's a claim that arises. And in this case, they assessed it. But I wanted to know, like, what did they conclude and how did they make those determinations? And what was the original intelligence for this airstrike? Now, I didn't know what the likelihood of my getting this was, but I sort of sat back and I thought, like, okay, I know that there is a sort of long delay with the Pentagon. It can take years to get the results of your records. So why don't I just look up the DoD FOIA handbook and just look at what they say the grounds are for expedited processing. And let me also just like be really specific. So let me just pull up the grounds first. So, I looked this up in the DoD handbook, and I was used to asking for expedited processing on the basis of, that this information is urgently needed by an individual primarily engaged in disseminating information in order to inform the public concerning actual or alleged government activity. That kind of public interest argument that is often made. And that's the one I was the most familiar with. But I didn't at the time know about this other aspect of it, that a failure to obtain records on an expedited basis could reasonably be expected to pose an imminent threat to the life or physical safety of an individual, as well as this humanitarian in need. These were not things I was familiar with beforehand. And so I just looked that up and I was like, that's so interesting. And we're going to come back to this in a second, but I kind of flagged all of that. But I knew that, so we're going to come back to expedited processing, but that was just some of the early research I did. But the main piece of advice that I can give you if you're looking for something specific is to be specific in your request. And so I'm just going to go back one slide. So I knew that U.S. Central Command was the agency that I was going to request information from. It wasn't the DoD that you go to in this case. That Operation Inherent Resolve was taking place through U.S. Central Command, and they had these records, that would be who I should be requesting it from. And, it's not like I had a case file to cite. So I gave them a date range and I explained that date range. And I said very specifically, so like I'm looking for this credibility assessment into a claim of harm on these two structures between these dates. And I said, here's some additional information to assist you in finding these records. And I gave them the approximate time that this airstrike took place, which had been told to me in an email from one of those US Central Command spokespeople that I was talking to. And I attached that email in my request. And then I said, like, this credibility assessment was completed on this date, something that that person, that spokesperson had also told me. And I also included the email addresses, which I've redacted here, of two officials whom I'd been in communication with about this, in case like you're having trouble locating this. These two people that I've been talking to confirmed its existence and they might be able to help you. And so being really specific about them kind of gave them no way to say like, well, we don't know what you're talking about, because I'd already encountered that we don't know what you're talking about because of that date range issue. In the video, they claimed it was on one day, and then elsewhere they had said that it happened on another date. And so when I had asked about it, using what the date on the video, they didn't find it in their records. The reason being the difference between local time and military time. And so, I would encourage you to be really specific. So that was the first thing that I did, is I laid out like, here's what I'm looking for. Here's what it is exactly. Here's how you can find it. But with respect to the expedited processing, I was trying to meet, many of these, and I can meet the federal government activity one pretty easily. But in talking to Bassem Razo, he had told me about what he feared as a result of this airstrike. And one of the things that he had done that I had included in the uncounted is that, let me find it. He had put a report together and gone to the US Embassy in Baghdad and had turned this in to the state, to the US Embassy, saying like, here's what happened to me. This is what happened to my family. And he said, the most important issue is that we are now looked at as members of ISIS, thus leaving us in an awkward situation in the local community and later with the authorities after the liberation of Mosul. So he had taken this 9-page document to the embassy, and one of the things he'd articulated, not just to the consular officer he spoke with, but in this document he wrote, was that he was afraid of reprisal violence, basically. And so one of the things I did in that FOIA, that first FOIA I submitted, was I said, you should release these records to me on an expedited basis because there is potential harm to someone's life. Bassem Razo is afraid that he will be targeted incorrectly for being ISIS because this airstrike struck him and his family. And there was a video uploaded and you called them a car bombing factory on this video. And he is afraid for his life. He's afraid of the harm. And then I also attached news articles that showed that there was a lot of reprisal violence in territories that had been retaken from ISIS. And I showed that like, I can publish a news story based on this that clears his name, right? Because you've concluded him to be a civilian, and yet you have not made this information public. And so, I certified, so, I attached these different kinds of exhibits. So like the emails that confirmed a credibility assessment took place, and the time of the strike, but also Bassem Razo's document stating that he was worried about reprisal violence, and then news reports about reprisal violence. And I just made the case that this particular request met 3 different factors for expedited processing. And ultimately, and we can get into this, they agreed. They agreed that the US military said that I was granted expedited processing. And we can give the short version of this, but I was able to get that within about 4 months instead of, I don't know how many years it would have taken. And so I'll show you what that resulting document looked like. But basically, I knew I now had a means to, let me actually pull this up for you. I knew I now had a means to get these records using these different arguments. So I just want to show you what the document looked like. It gave really specific details. This is just an excerpt of it. And obviously there were redactions, but it gave details about, what they had observed. So, the surveillance footage, for example, the FMV had shown, 7 men, no women, and no children, these adult males opening and closing the gate of their house. They didn't observe any children or domestic activities. And it goes on to basically say that, while no overtly nefarious activity was observed, that there was access control from the gatekeeping, which was a standard ISIS practice, and other sorts of factors that, like, this particular document basically stated that they may have confused his house with something that was next door. It also stated that they filmed for only like an hour and a half during some of the hottest hours of the day during the summer in Mosul, when like Bassem wouldn't be out and about. And I basically took this document and I sat down with Bassem and I went over it with him. And it was that never happens, right? Like, it's so rare. And at that same, around that time, I was also doing a sample of other airstrikes. And I saw the value, in the Uncounted, I had done, I told Bassem's journey, and you can see towards the end, he gets the document and you can like read what he felt and thought as he went through it. And that was so powerful. But I also, from this experiment, didn't just know it was possible to get documents, but I knew what the power that obtaining these documents has, not just in showing, what they thought, but if I can fact check it on the ground, if I can find survivors, and if I can do the same thing, I felt like there was a lot more potential for truly understanding. Because back in the Uncounted, I did that sample with Anand Gopal, and we concluded that 1 in 5 airstrikes was resulting in a civilian death, a rate that was 31 times higher than what the US military was admitting. And that's important. We know that we knew that civilians were dying at much higher rates, but why they were happening was harder to tell without these documents. And I kind of just was like, what can I do to try to get these others?
Azmat, before you go into the FOIAs for the civilian casualty files, I just wanted to point out a couple things with respect to your earlier requests that I think are really helpful for people to think about. So FOIAing is often really difficult because on the outside, the government agency often just looks like a black box, right? We're like, there's a lot of stuff in there, but I don't know what it is. I don't know what it's called. I don't know how it's organized. And that's really hard when it comes to FOIA because the law requires you to reasonably describe the records that you are requesting. And so what I think is great about your request is that you had done background reporting, you had conversations with government officials, and you had figured out that there was a process involved, right? Like, governments love processes, right? Everything you do, there's like some kind of process. And you pointed to the process and you said, look, here's this process. I know the process needs to be followed whenever X happens. So I want the documents from the process related to X. And I think that that's a really effective strategy. It's something that the Reporters Committee does in some of its FOIA requests. We say, look, I know there's like a regulation here, or there's an SOP or something. So like stuff has to be generated as part of that, and give that to me. The other things you did were you attached all kinds of stuff. And that is great because just as from the outside, we often see government agencies as a black box. So too, when the agency gets a FOIA request from us, they don't know what really you're like doing, right? Like, they know, okay, they're interested in maybe this general subject area, but they have very little context for understanding what's going on. So what you've done in attaching all of these things and providing all the detail that you have is give them additional clues to try to find records that are responsive to your request, right? You had pointed them in the way of different government officials who might be able to assist. All of that detail going into the request is going to produce better results in terms of the agency at least finding the records that you're after. In terms of processing them, I really appreciate your like strategy for using these kind of novel expedited processing arguments. And they worked here. They don't always work. A lot of requests for expedited processing are denied, but here they did, and I think that that's a really good example, not only of creative, I would say even like lawyering on your part, but also the importance of doing your homework about the agency regs, right? It's not just about understanding the law when it comes to FOIA. You also sometimes have to dig into the agency regulations because sometimes they do have funky stuff like that. The Department of Treasury used to have a requirement that you had to sign your FOIA requests, like physically sign them. And if you didn't do that, they would bounce them. And that's like a really horrible state of affairs, right? You get all the way up in the queue and then they bounce it because you didn't like sign this request. So all of that is to say, FOIA is not just about like writing something down and quick firing it off. The more homework you can do, the more work you can do on the front end, it's going to help you at least increase your chances of getting a good result. So Azmat, let me ask you then about how did you take what you learned in doing the FOIA for Bassem Razo's incident, and how did you apply that in your subsequent FOIA request that's later became part of the lawsuit that is still ongoing?
I know, poor you. Poor Adam has been working on this for ages. Well, so, when I was given expedited processing, I was like, ooh, this works. Didn't, but it was, after that, I was like, why don't I try to file for, how I mentioned there were these like monthly civilian casualty releases, these press releases that U.S. Central Command was putting out. I had already been creating a database of those, right? Because I needed to compare what their numbers showed to what I was finding on the ground. And I'm just going to share screen here. But I had made a database of, every single, these are the non-credibles, but any single incident they deemed credible, as in they accepted civilian casualties had happened, and any that they deemed non-credible. And they said casualties did not occur for a number of reasons. And I'd already started to basically input details from them, cite the press release. I created my own kind of database of these. And so I had accessible all of these different kinds of, the mere calling of something as credible or non-credible means that at least an assessment has taken place. And so knowing that, everything in one of these press releases should have an assessment associated with it. It might be a short one, it could be a long, full investigation, but every single one of these is supposed to have underlying documentation. And so, I started out first with Iraq. I think in the first request, I asked for everything credible from Iraq. The second request, it was everything else that was deemed credible from Iraq and Syria. And by the time I filed the third request, I was asking for everything credible and non-credible from that they had ever admitted to. And so in total, that was like 1,397 assessments in total. I don't remember off the top of my head anymore, but basically I requested them and I attached, similar to what I showed you before, the press releases as exhibits. So I included those in here saying like, here is evidence from your own records, these US Central Command press releases showing, this is the incident that I'm asking for, that I'm requesting this particular thing. So they could locate the records and also so that I could make sure that I was being very clear about what it was that I wanted. And at the same time, I also asked for expedited processing. Now, because by that, at some point I had published the uncounted. And so I think it was by the time of the third request, I had published already. So because I'd written about Bassem Razo and his fears of reprisal violence and attached that report, I actually had a lot more to cite now, stating that survivors feared reprisal violence. And I was able to, I'm going to pull it up here. So I was able to, in my request for expedited processing, I was able to say, I think there were 100 civilians involved in the credible cases I was asking for the particular excerpt we're looking at. And so, I had said, look, these people fear this very serious threat of reprisal violence. And I gave like more detailed explanations of that. I also cited the humanitarian interests. And lastly, that that aspect of I am a person primarily engaged in disseminating information and there's an urgency to inform. So I put all of that in there. And then one second, I'm just going to show you what those requests looked like. They wound up being quite long because they were, they had those kinds of full, so this is one that's 307 pages, but only because, I think in large part because of the attachments. So, you can see here, let's pull this up, that I had requested these particular records. And I said, see this exhibit for, the credibility assessment. And I would quote the language from the press release. And so by the time, I was done doing that, you're looking at, goodness, you were 14 pages in, right? And then I also attached all of those press releases, which is why it's long. I asked for a fee waiver for being a journalist. I requested expedited processing for the reasons that I just mentioned. And I kind of bulleted these three and then gave longer explanations of it, even citing the uncounted and using Bossam's story as part of the, I put an excerpt of that in here. And I put all of that together with those attachments. And the attachments also had, for example, I'm going to skip past this, but the attachments also had those news reports of reprisal violence in addition to like the uncounted. And I think it's going to take too long to get through this. So I'm just going to go towards the very bottom. But I also, because I was saying that it was of importance to federal government activity, I also cited all of these different groups and basically anything I could show to show that this was really important to the public, that it concerned federal government activity. And a lot of that was just response to the uncounted and to things different congressional officials had said. So, I had included all of that, like, what do we owe, this particular senator who's been so active on these issues. I included these op-eds, these different articles from different individuals who were saying, these are two former members of the Obama administration who said that they, were part of an administration that fell short. So I attached all of these different kinds of examples that this was of public interest, and I also included it. So I wasn't just asking only on the basis of imminent harm, because remember, that may not work. They'd already denied me expedited processing, for some of my next requests on that basis. And, I wanted to try each of the three issues that I was citing. I wanted to show as extensively as I could. So including a lot of that documentation about why this was important to democracy, how little transparency there had been. So when I was requesting these, there were maybe like 3 to 4 assessments that had ever been made public. And I had cited that. I had shown what was already out there and also how important and valuable these can be. And so I think it was after the second request, I filed the Bossum request and I filed the next one for all of the Iraq credibles. And that's when I was like, I think I was denied expedited processing. And I was like, I'm going to need help. It's not going to be this simple. And I started going to different, legal clinics that exist, pro bono clinics, lawyers that I know of, and oftentimes their schedules fill up very early, and there's a lot. It's not like they could immediately start working on my case. And so I got a series of very polite and kind rejections. And I wrote a nice email to the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, just laying out the basic details, not too long, but laying out here's what I've been trying to get. Here's what I'm trying to do. And, here's the latest on this. I'd love your help. And the next day I get this email from Adam and we set up a time to talk. And, they agreed to sort of take this, down through the process of administrative appeals and ultimately litigation.
Yeah. And Azmat, I just want to emphasize again for people who didn't pick up on the length of Azmat's second request, but in excess of 300 pages. And that is a long FOIA request, no doubt, but it has a lot of advantages. One is that because Azmat included everything, not just links to things, but actually included copies of stuff, that could be really helpful later on, especially as you all are thinking about your own FOIAs. Guess what? Administrations change, the DoD website changes. Do you want to be stuck trying to like go through the Wayback Machine, like trying to find links to stuff that once existed? Or if it's just all attached to your request, you can just say see exhibit, G, as Azmat has done, and as we have done throughout the litigation. It's incredibly handy. The other reason.
Ask you a question. Oops,
yes. Yeah. No. Go ahead.
So when people are coming to you to ask for what do you want? Like, what is helpful? At what stage should they be in? How should they think about it when they're like, where am I with this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll say the very lawyerly response, which is it really depends. So, I like to think that FOIA is such that journalists without legal training can do both requests and administrative appeals on their own. And to help them along with that, I'm going to share my screen now. We provide some resources, including the Foia Wiki, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's like Wikipedia, but for the federal FOIA. And this is for people who need to know about, what are they doing? What is FOIA? How do I do things? What is the law? As I said at the top, FOIA is more than 50 years old now, and there are literally thousands and thousands of cases interpreting it. There are agency regulations, there are practices, and both formal and informal. And so what we've tried to do in the Foia Wiki, which is an ongoing and evolving process, is to help demystify some of the FOIA world and put it in one place so that people can get help without having to come to a lawyer. So for example, you now know in FOIAing an agency, you might need to look up their regulations, right? So how do you find the DoD FOIA regs? If you haven't memorized it, because maybe you're a normal human being, you can go to the Foia Wiki and search Department of Defense. And you click on that and look, there's a whole page that is just for DoD. We have all kinds of stuff about sub-agencies, what types of records are available, any tips or tricks or anything like that. And on the sidebar here, we also have some kind of more structured data when it comes to DoD. And one of those is their FOIA regulations. We have the FOIA regs for every single agency. Look, you just click on it. Oh, look, even the CFR has changed. Okay. So again, more reasons why you need to make copies of everything. But here we go. It's in, Title 32, subpart 286. Cool. I don't need to know that. I just need to know that I go to the FOIA Wiki. If you submit a FOIA request and you get a denial of expedited processing, if the agency substantively denies you on the basis of an exemption, or the agency just doesn't respond, you can do an administrative appeal on your own, and you can use the FOIA Wiki to help you. So say, for example, that you get a response back and the agency says, no, this is all exempt under the deliberative process privilege. Well, you can go to the Foia Wiki page on the deliberative process privilege, and it has all kinds of stuff that helps explain what is the deliberative process privilege? How do I overcome it? What are its limitations? What does the case law say on all of this? And we provide all this because we really do think that it's important for journalists to be able to do this on their own without the assistance of an attorney, because there are way more journalists and way more FOIA requests than there are attorneys doing FOIA work. So we want to do everything we can to help people. But in your case, you did come to us, and we helped with an administrative appeal. In fact, many administrative appeals. And so let me show just really quick what those look like. And this is all on the web somewhere, so we can give links to this. But here is what they look like. So, it comes from me. It's sent to DoD. Has the date, how I'm sending it. I'm reference here the date, or the request number. This is one of Azmat's requests. And I write them, I say, dear FOIA officer, this is an administrative appeal under FOIA. And this was concerning the denial of expedited processing. So that's what we were focused on in this administrative appeal. But for a denial based on either an exemption claim or non-responsiveness, it's going to look similar, at least in its broad terms. So we have some introductory stuff, and then we have the procedural history. This is why it's so important for you to have detailed records of everything, because when either a journalist comes to me, or you're doing your own administrative appeal, or you're talking to some other attorney, they're going to want a history of everything so that they can write this section, which is just like, what has happened? We're going to attach everything and document it up the wazoo. So there's no ambiguity, right, as to what's going on. So I lay out all the procedural history, March 28th, 2017. Azmat submitted this, they CENTCOM said they wanted more time. CENTCOM denied expedited processing. And now here we are. And then we have an argument section, right? So here we were arguing primarily on the more journalistic public interest prong of expedited processing. But nothing that's in here law-wise is not going to be in the Foia Wiki. Or in other words, pretty much everything in here is in the Foia Wiki, right? So what you or anyone doing an administrative appeal needs to do is take the basic bones of the law and then make an argument about it. So here we're citing first the law, and then a lot of that reporting that Azmat was talking about earlier that she cited when she was making her request, trying to show that there was an urgent need in terms of the contemporary public discourse for more information about this, right? And this goes on and on and on and on for many pages. Not quite as many pages as Azmat, because I think her FOIA request is even more documented than the administrative appeal is. But that's what you do. I mean, there's no real, secret to it. It's just that you need to make a convincing argument with the law, and we provide you the law, and then you make the argument. So anyway, that is the administrative appeal. But certainly there are other times when people really do need our help, where they've run to the end of the road in terms of what they can do, and they need a lawyer. So the Reporters Committee has a hotline that's available online. You can call us, you can email us. The best way to do it is through a form that we have. It's at rcfp.org/hotline. And that will go to attorneys and legal fellows at the Reporters Committee. We often in the FOIA context get involved when someone has exhausted their administrative remedies, so when they've already done the administrative appeal and either haven't gotten a response or have gotten an adverse response. But sometimes we also do get involved earlier. If it seems like it's a case that we want to litigate and we want to get in on the ground a little bit more quickly, then sometimes we will do administrative appeals as well. And in terms of how we evaluate those, we look at a few things. We look at, is this case going to be an impact case? Is the subject matter of the request particularly important, or is there an opportunity to make good law? We also look at things like, are you a freelancer or a nonprofit, right? Do you really have a need for legal assistance such that it would be difficult for you to pay for an attorney elsewhere? And I'll just tell you, I look for really good documentation. So when I see, things like Azmat's Tracker, again, it makes me so happy. And it makes it really easy actually to be a lawyer, because I can just plug everything in and it's all ready to go. So yeah, those are some of the things that we look for and when you should think about maybe coming to an attorney, probably after the administrative appeals process has run. But sometimes if you need a little help, we can point you in the right direction.
Adam, how important is it to appeal in order to eventually litigate? Like, should you always appeal?
You should always appeal. You really should. So if you're going to litigate, you have to appeal, unless the agency just hasn't responded. But if the agency has given you an adverse determination, you have to file administrative appeal before going into litigation. That's just required by the law in almost all circumstances. Even if you don't think that you're going to litigate, though, you should file an administrative appeal because it might work. And in fact, it does work a lot of the time. I haven't looked up the numbers from fiscal year 2020 yet, which is the latest year, but generally, I would say administrative appeals are successful in maybe 1/3 to 2/3 of like cases, depending upon the issue. So you should absolutely file an administrative appeal. It will take, an hour or 2 or 3, or maybe an afternoon, but why not? Like, you stand to benefit from it. And you just like should. So yes, always file an administrative appeal. That's why we have the Foia Wiki. That's why we have samples up there. You should always file administrative appeals.
Yeah. And if it's helpful, like I know for me, I took the first administrative appeal that they had helped me with. And then going forward, you can just plagiarize yourself or, whatever it is. If you have a good example of that, you can, I updated a lot of the links, when I had more contemporary ones, but later on down the line for other requests and whatnot, I was filing my own administrative appeals. And the reason why I asked, should you always, is because yeah, you should always file administrative appeal, something I learned from RCFP. And if you asked for expedited processing and were denied it, that's a really good means. It's probably faster to go that route and appeal and then litigate than it would be if you were just in a queue for a long time and they'd never denied you something. So I think it's worth asking for expedited processing, even if you don't think your chances are good.
And Azmat, one other thing on that is I really encourage people to look at the data when it comes to different agencies. So I'm going to share my screen one more time. So this is Foia.gov, which is the Federal Freedom of Information portal. And you can do a lot of things here like file FOIA requests, but that's not the secret tip. The secret tip is over here under agency FOIA data. So if you go over here and click annual data, you'll see it comes up with some stuff. And then you can type in an agency name and get information about how they process FOIA. So let's type in like the FBI. And then what do we want to find out? We want to find out how long does it take for them to process stuff. So we're going to go down to processing time. And we're going to look at the last 3 years. And if you do this, you get this long spreadsheet. And it's going to separate out the requests into 3 different tracks. So the simple track, the complex track, and the expedited track. And then it gives you data about that. So you can see the average number of days for the FBI to fulfill a simple FOIA request. About 16 to 24 days, not too bad, right? But then let's go over to complex. These are averages, remember. We're looking in the closer to 1 year mark, right? And then let's go over to expedited. Again, these are averages. It depends upon the year, but it could be less, could be more. I don't know. So I encourage people to look at the data because it may inform you about whether you should try to go narrower in the scope of your request, right? Ask for fewer records. Or if you have to go broad, so like Azmat, she just wanted records on every single one of these airstrikes. That's just part of her project. She needs to have a broader request. So in those type of instances, it may make sense to, and probably does in fact make sense, to ask for expedited processing because you can't do too much to narrow or modify the scope of your request.
That's very helpful. Thanks, Adam. What kind of caution or what might you tell reporters about the expectations of timelines and the likelihood of getting records and their own editorial strategy as well?
Yeah, so this is a really important thing to think about because even after all of the homework that Azmat did on the front end, we are still litigating the 2 lawsuits now related to her requests. The first one at least has been going on for a few years at this point. And the reason for that is even after you get into litigation, after you get an attorney, after you file a complaint, it can still take a really long time to complete the FOIA process. So the reasons for that are a fewfold. first you've got to file a lawsuit, right? Your attorneys are going to need some time to write it, file it. It's got to be served, it has to be like mailed to the agencies. And then the government has a whole month to respond just to the complaint. And they might ask for more time, and they frequently do. So it might be 2 months for the government to respond to the complaint. Okay, great. You have a response, hopefully in the form of an answer, not a motion to dismiss. But now you have to actually get into the weeds of what is going to happen in terms of looking for and producing records. You might find out that the agency has done nothing with response to a FOIA request, right? They haven't even started looking for records. So the government might say, okay, we need 2 or 3 or 4 months to look for records. Okay, so you have to like go through that. And then the government has to process records. And this is something that's really hotly contested in a lot of FOIA litigation. Azmat, it was, as you know, contested at various points during your case, because the government, even in litigation, is going to want to process things at a pretty slow rate. So one standard well, I wouldn't even say it's a standard, but frequently I'll say in district court in DC, where I am, agencies will process records at 500 pages a month. And for some lawyers who might do like civil discovery, that seems like just a laughably slow pace. And yet courts frequently allow that, or even much slower paces for producing records. It might be 100 pages a month or 300 pages every 2 months. Sometimes you will get court orders with a more expedient schedule, but oftentimes you're looking at potentially months or years of processing records. Even after the government starts producing records, there might be problems with them, right? So Azmat, this has come up in some of your cases, for example. The government might locate the wrong records, or they might have overlooked a particular record that you asked for, or something might happen such that it's not complete. So then the attorneys have to get back together, the agency has to go back and look for records again, and then figure out what to do from there. After even all of that, now you're in a position where the parties might need to fight or not fight about things like redactions or whether the government search was good enough. That might involve a briefing process with the court, which can take, maybe 3 to 6 months, depending upon how things go. And then you have to wait for the court to get around to your case and decide it. District courts are incredibly burdened with all kinds of cases. I don't even know how many an individual judge might have, but it's a lot. So it can take a year, maybe a year and a half for you to get a decision on a motion for summary judgment in a FOIA lawsuit. And depending upon what that is, there might be an appeal, there might be additional processing of records. These things can go on for a long time. There's FOIA litigation that's been going on for decades in some cases. So this can be a really, really drawn out process. Sometimes you can, as Azmat has done, publish things along the way that are just incredibly revelatory. But sometimes, you might have to make decisions about, are you going to go ahead with what you have, even if that's nothing, or you're going to try to wait around for the FOIA process and litigation to end. It's good to go into even litigation with an understanding that this is not going to be instantaneous. And much as I would like it to be, and much as I think everyone in the public would like it to be, sometimes it just takes a while.
Yeah. One thing that I was really grateful to you guys all, to you and Katie and Gunita and everybody as I was working on this, is that sometimes I would tell them, oh, hey, I'm going to this village. I'm going to Tokhar, Syria, like in a few days. Would it be possible to get the document before then? And, there were particular things that they might prioritize in their next I think it would be like next month I'll be going there. I think a few days is too tight of a time frame unless you just happen to be in conversation with them. But to my great frustration, Tokhar, like a major civilian casualty incident, we were trying to get before I went. And the night I returned, I opened my email and it had arrived. But so but that's something to think about. I also really, really advise you to maintain that system. Like if you have a really organized system in your request, maintain it, because as things start to come in and you're matching what, especially if it's a large data set, and you're like, did this arrive? Did it not? Whatever it might be, is this complete? Is it not? And you're doing these back and forths to say like, this is missing. Like, should see the spreadsheets I made to say like, here are like the 90 in which the credibility assessment I have says an investigation was recommended, but they never gave us an investigation. These aren't in the documents that I received. And maintaining that, and I'm just going to show you, because also if you're going to analyze the records, if you're going to look for trends, that's going to take time. And depending on the nature of the records you're getting, there's also a level of like learning you have to do. So like for me, it was like not just redactions, but there was like military jargon all over the place. And some of it I knew, like, you know, there's certain words I learned and knew. And then there were other things that just really somebody who's writing these report could tell you. It's not like just a random military source would know what this particular thing meant. And so there was like a lot of research I did in the beginning to learn what each thing meant. I built like an explainer on that. I like pulled from all of these interviews and I went over things with sources. And I'm just going to quickly share a screen of a screenshot I took so you don't see the actual thing. But you can see that, you know, once you've done this in this manner, you can put, you know, you can keep a case folder. Eventually I had a case folder for each, you know, requested incident and record. And, you know, I would keep informal notes or whatever it is, but then I could create categories that would allow me to study them systematically. And that's how, just to bring this back to the civilian casualty files and then open it up to questions for everyone, you know, that was the basis for this. And in the beginning, like I was alone and it was, you know, stressful. And I can't tell you how wonderful it was to have, you know, people like Adam and Katie and Gunita at RCFP to talk about this with. I think that was really useful in thinking through, but also just as a journalist, you want to figure out what your approach to this should be. And as I mentioned earlier, for me, my goal was not just to publish them, it was to study them and analyze them in aggregate, but then also like match them to people on the ground as much as I could. And, you know, the pandemic disrupted some of that reporting, but I'd been doing it for a while as much as I could. And then last year I was able to do like a sizable, I spent a few months in Mosul trying to, you know, match as many of the 90 credibles as I could to people on the ground. And, you know, it was actually like such incredible. I was just talking to Momin Mohanad, this, he was, when we met, a student at the University of Mosul's Department of Translation, and we were working together. And like, I can't tell you what it meant to be able to take those documents and like match them to people who were involved or their loved ones, and then have these conversations that just would not exist in any other world, right? Where somebody who had been wronged in this fashion has a chance to respond to, like, they actually know why they were targeted and like respond to it. And it was just like an act of journalism that like, it took years to get there, but like, I wouldn't have done it any differently. I wouldn't have just dumped these online. I wouldn't have just saved them for my book and like not, you know, prioritized publishing it as soon as I put it in context and done that other reporting. It was just, so I would be very thoughtful about it. If you've spent a lot, if you've poured a lot of time into it, you don't need to be on somebody else's clock. Well, I think we don't really have a choice sometimes if you're within a newsroom. But I think that if you can find a way to get that support, and you can go to the Gumshoe Group's website to get some of that support, it can be really useful. But I think it might be here, unless you want to add more, Adam, it might be useful to open it up to questions.
Definitely. Feel free, everyone, to put them in the chat if you have questions, and we'll definitely try to address them. Azmat, while people are typing, I just want to say that I totally agree, and I think that a lot of the power of your reporting in the civilian casualty files come from the marrying of the documents with your reporting on the ground, with the individual stories, with all of the work you had done up front. You know, it's really, you know, there is like a document dump, like, right, there's a part where you actually put out all the documents, which is amazing. I love it when reporters do that because I love seeing the underlying docs. But there's in the reporting itself, there's so much contextualization, there's so much analysis, and it really shows and makes the reporting remarkable. So let's see, let's get some questions in the chat.
I see one that says, as a reporter and also as an attorney, how do you navigate figuring out what records might be classified and how that restricts your access to them? That's a great question.
Go for it. I'll chime in after.
Well, I mean, I think you can talk in greater detail about this, but yeah, I mean, there are certain things that from looking at a lot of these, I know I won't get or that will always be redacted. And sometimes there are things you won't expect, but like sometimes they'll give me the details of, you know, why something went wrong and I'm surprised to get it, but the weapon will always be redacted. And that's something I only learned over time. But I say this only because for a while I wanted to do like storytelling wise, I wanted to follow a plane and take you through like the exact bomb they dropped and realize that that bomb or plane was never going to be listed in these records. And maybe I could deduce, maybe sometimes there would be like an errant redaction or there would be a code name in there and I could figure it out from that, but that other reporting would have to get me there. But obviously exact locations were redacted from the records in almost all cases. You know, names of individuals, unless they were like signing and they were quite senior. A lot of things were redacted that I didn't expect. And it only took, you know, it's pouring through these over a significant period of time. And then there's also just like negotiations you make where it's like, we're going to, for example, not include any of the exhibits for now, just so we can process these records in a timely fashion. And then later on, if there are exhibits that you want us to procure for you, we can do that on a case-by-case basis. And you might work out those arrangements with them as well. But in terms of what's classified, you know, they have different citations that they use for why they're redacting something. And there's some that are, you know, it would impede an ongoing investigation, or, you know, there's ones that are, it would harm national security. And you can look up in the Foia Wiki each one, because I think, yeah, there's so many that get used and some of them can be kind of unique.
Yeah, I mean, so just as a pure legal matter, there is an executive order that was issued by then President Obama that is the current, for the most part, prevailing order on classification. It has in it both substantive criteria that a record is supposed to meet before it can be classified, and then also procedural requirements. So, you know, there has to be markings on it and those types of things. That's what the law is in this area. But in practice, trying to figure out why the government classifies something or doesn't classify something is just mystifying. I had a former client, Bart Gelman, who describes at one point coming across a classified instruction manual for a Navy clothes washing machine. Like the instruction manual was classified. And why? It's just for washing clothes. And then you see other things and you're like, I don't know, that seems like it could arguably be within the scope of things. Like, why isn't this classified? I think it's really, really hard to know in advance unless you have examples of similar records. And I will tell you that once you get into litigation, even, courts are very deferential to agency claims of classification. As a general matter, courts do not want to be second guessing agencies when it comes to a special national security harm assertions. And so exemption 1, which is the classification exemption, exemption 1 litigation is very, very hard for plaintiffs.
We have another question from Nick Donovan. Hello from the UK. Have you seen US FOIA requests successfully used to find information on US views or findings about a specific wrongdoing by a foreign government or military? I see an unsuccessful lawsuit by the UK all-party parliamentary group on extraordinary rendition. I imagine there are a lot of classification rules on foreign relations. Are there exemptions to those? That's a great question. And I would also wonder how collaborative, I think I'll let you take this in a second, Adam, but I would just say, I also wonder how collaborative the particular involvement is between the US and that other country, because, if the US has a significant amount of involvement, you can request those records on that basis. Looking at this in the prism of airstrikes, the most experience I've had with this is related to the Netherlands, which I was just there like last week, and talking to these two fantastic reporters. I think one of whom is in the group right now. Kies, you're here, right? Yes, Kies Versteeg and Ben Mindertsma had also requested the details of this Dutch airstrike in Hawija. It was a US and Dutch airstrike. The Americans did the intelligence. The coalition, a Dutch aircraft carried it out. Similar to the airstrike on Bassam Razo, there's similar Dutch involvement as well. And it was actually Ben and Kies. I think Ben filed the FOIA in the United States to get the records into Hawija. And that I learned is actually how those records first came into public view. And it worked, even though, when it comes to the Dutch government, like this, their involvement was extremely controversial, and it almost resulted, it was covered up. This is a whole backstory here. I'm going to get us distracted. But basically, what Dutch journalists have done on this beat is so impressive. Like, I am so impressive, and we're actively thinking about ways in which we might be able to learn more about the involvement of other coalition countries. But there is, depending on how much collaboration there are means to do it. And I was really just blown away that like Dutch journalists were filing FOIAs in the United States and getting vast amounts of records. So it is possible. But Adam, I think you can speak to in greater detail about that.
Yeah, so I noted at the beginning that you don't have to be a US citizen or live in the US to use the US federal FOIA, which is great. If you are doing state public records requests, some states do have restrictions where you have to be a citizen, but that's not true at the federal level. Anyone can file a federal FOIA request. The exemptions in the executive order pertaining to foreign relations between the United States and other countries around the world are pretty expansive, and I would say they are applied even more expansively. And so it can be really, really difficult to get those types of things. That might be an instance where your the FOIA part of your reporting strategy is a little less likely to bear fruit, and you might have to look at other routes. It's pretty difficult. And if an agency asserts an exemption 1 claim because they say it's classified, again, it's going to be hard to convince them at the administrative appeal level that they're wrong. And it's also going to be hard even in litigation to challenge that. It's not impossible. There are successful litigation challenges for exemption 1, but it's difficult. There's a question in the chat about.
Can I just add one more thing to this conversation?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was just going to say that something I have a little bit of experience with is also if you're looking at national security investigations that span various countries, that sometimes, like in my experience, Sweden has like much more generous public records legislation. And the government has like to reply in a much shorter time frame. There's just like way more rights for reporters and the public. So it's also possible to try to obtain records there that maybe include some details that you could then bring back to use in your FOIA here. So trying to think about how to work collaboratively with reporters there, or yeah.
That's a great point. And in fact, if I'm remembering correctly, Sweden has the oldest public records law in the world. I think it was started in like the 18th century. So that's great to hear. I always tell people in my FOIA trainings to be like the FOIA octopus, right? Like you want to have lots of different tentacles, like all trying to get towards the same thing, but maybe in slightly different ways. And using different laws to your advantage is like such a great way to do that.
Great.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to put in these links. If you want editorial help with your FOIA requests, I just put in the link for contacting Gumshoe about that, as well as if this is something that I'm very passionate about, which is that the long timeline of FOIA, like these can take years. If you're a freelancer, you're not going to get paid for that work for the longest time. And so there's all of these different barriers to entry. And if you're thinking about like, how can I afford this or what can I do? We have that payment scheme that I know Aviva talked about earlier, but I just want to encourage you to apply. I think we've extended the deadline by another 2 weeks. I have to double check, but basically, payment scheme, basically, I think that it's worth putting in the time to research the request before you submit it and get it right the first time. And, sure, you may not be spending years on this, but that early investment of work, it would be great if you could get paid back for it. And so we have these grants, they're like between 1,000 and a little more than that, to just assist you with filing some of these if they're in the public interest and they're significant. And I encourage you to apply. Applications close May 11th. Thanks, Aviva. That's great. Any other questions?
Azmat, there's a question in the chat about trying to get information out of the legislative branch of the US government. Yeah, so when Congress wrote FOIA, it did not apply it to itself. It only applies to the executive branch. There has been, I would say, very limited success in trying to get certain types of records from Congress under the common law right of access. There was a successful effort by Jason Leopold fairly recently, I think, to get records from the United States Capitol Police. But FOIA doesn't apply to Congress. That's just not what it does. So again, you're going to have to think about other more creative ways, I think, when you're thinking about the legislative branch. At the state level in the US, there are some public records laws that cover the legislative branch. You can look that up in the Reporters Committee's Open Government Guide. So if you go to rcfp.org/OGG, and I'll put the link in the chat, we have very, very detailed public records guides for every single state and the District of Columbia. And part of what those guides go over is, what is the scope of the public records law? Might it also apply to the legislative branch? And in some instances, it does.
And if you're feeling shy about asking a question here, like don't hesitate to reach out. You can reach out via Gumshoe, or you can message on, you can DM on Twitter, etc. But yeah, I hope this has been helpful, and I hope that others do similar kinds of FOIA related reporting from other war zones and other places. I know that what I just described can seem really daunting because it was years in the making and it was being on the ground. But I also want to point out like the work of some of my extraordinary colleagues, who used OSINT related tools to deconstruct the Kabul strike, for example. And some of whom, sometimes you're not on the ground for particular things. There was a major investigation into a US airstrike in Baghouz, Syria that was covered up, that they didn't go to the ground for that, but they were able to really work sources and get lots of things in other means. And I know I submitted FOIA requests related to it as well. So I hope that this doesn't seem extremely daunting. I think there are other ways into this work that can be about a single strike or a particular case, and you can kind of build from there.
And I'll just say before finishing up, please do contact the Reporters Committee hotline as well. As I mentioned, we have a special place in our heart for freelancers and nonprofit newsrooms. But any journalist can contact the hotline, and even short of an attorney at the Reporters Committee representing you, the hotline can answer, provide information about public records requests, all kinds of stuff when it comes to reporting. And so we definitely encourage you to reach out if you ever have a question.
Yeah, and they're amazing. Go ahead.
I just wanted to thank Adam and Azmat for such a wonderful and important chat. We're so grateful to be able to learn from you. And if anybody, please feel free to get in touch with me or Azmat or anyone from Gumshoe if you have any other questions about us. But thank you so much, Adam, Azmat. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming in. We appreciate